Welcome to Despicable Main Deep Dives. Today on the show,
A world leader, maybe the most powerful person on the planet, just skipping all the usual diplomacy, forget the quiet phone calls, the secret meetings, the carefully crafted statements.
right? None of that.
Instead, they just hop on a social media and post a direct threat. Not
Yeah.
subtle, not coded, just out there.
It sounds pretty wild when you put it like that, doesn't it? But I mean, that's exactly the kind of reality that really marked a huge chunk of recent international politics.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving deep into today. This really fascinating, sometimes honestly baffling world of how former President Donald Trump used social media as, well, a direct tool for foreign policy.
And that includes issuing what many saw as direct threats to other leaders, other countries. It's a complex area.
It really is. We're also going to get into the concept of gaslighting in politics. It's a term you hear a lot, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Yeah, we'll look at how it's been applied more broadly, say, in discussions around shaping perceptions of Israel, and also how critics argue Trump himself used those kinds of tactics.
And finally, related to all this, there's the criticism you often hear about Trump's communication style, this perception that it was at times distinctly childlike. We want to unpack what's behind that critique.
So, quite a bit to cover. For this deep dive, we've really dug into a wide range of sources. Analyses of Trump's actual social media posts, articles detailing what people called Twitter diplomacy.
Or truth social diplomacy later on.
Exactly. And also broader discussions from political science and communication studies about tactics like gaslighting, alongside those critical takes on his public image.
So our mission for you, listening in, is really to break down how these, let's call them unconventional communication strategies, actually work. What are the mechanisms?
And what are the consequences, the implications, both for people here at home and for audiences, leaders, diplomats around the world?
We want to give you some clarity on how these approaches really shaped, and maybe are still shaping, political conversations globally. Think of it as a shortcut to getting genuinely well-informed on a really unique chapter in modern politics.
Okay, ready to jump in.
Let's do it. So, first up, this idea of using social media for direct threats. How did a former U.S. president end up using platforms this way? I mean, so radically departing from established diplomatic norms, it feels like a complete break.
It really was, in many ways. Trump's presidency, it's almost impossible to talk about it without talking about his use of social media. It wasn't just an add-on.
No, it felt central.
Exactly. Central.
Yeah.
Especially for foreign policy. It became this primary channel, direct, often really confrontational. And when we say direct communication, we're not just talking about, speaking to the American people.
Right. This was aimed outwards.
Directly outwards.
Yeah.
An unfiltered line to foreign leaders, allies, adversaries. It just cut through all the layers of protocol, the careful wording, the diplomatic etiquette that's been built up over, well, centuries.
And this Twitter diplomacy, or later truth social diplomacy, the impact seems huge. Bypassing the State Department, bypassing those private talks.
Completely bypassing them. Everything was public, instantaneous. And this constantly surprised, sometimes really dismayed traditional diplomats. You have to remember, these are people trained in precision, in nuance.
The art of the carefully chosen word.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then suddenly a leader throws all that out the window with a public post. It becomes this public performance of strength almost, a confrontation played out for everyone to see.
And with character limits, there's not much room for subtlety, is there? Or for pulling things back behind the scenes if a message lands badly?
None at all. It's instant reaction, instant potential crisis. A single tweet, a single post could spark an international incident. Allies would be scrambling, trying to figure out U.S. intentions, while adversaries are left wondering, is this serious? Is it a bluff?
Which raises that fundamental question. What happens when the leader of a superpower uses such a blunt instrument for really serious international issues?
Well, the sources give us a really stark example. A very specific case involving a direct threat against Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This was posted by Trump on Truth Social, his platform, during a period of really high tension.
Okay, and what was the specific wording? Because that seems crucial here.
It is. The exact quote, and it's quite chilling when you think about it being posted publicly, was, "We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding."
Wow, we know exactly where. That's incredibly direct. Not passed through an ambassador, not in a classified briefing, just posted.
Posted.
Yeah.
Instantly available to billions worldwide, including Khamenei himself, his government, his people, and every other nation watching.
So how do you interpret that? We know where you are hiding. What does that actually signal?
Well, there are a few interpretations, and all of them are pretty destabilizing. The most common understanding is that it's a veiled threat, a threat of potential military action, suggesting, we have the capability to strike you personally.
Suggesting targeting capability.
Precisely. Some analyses in the sources we looked at went even further, suggesting it could even imply something more direct, like assassination, or at the very least, a very blunt declaration of intelligence prowess meant to intimidate.
Either way, it's a direct challenge. It's intimidation, not negotiation.
Absolutely. And it fits perfectly with what's understood as Trump's core belief: projecting strength, projecting resolve through very public statements, very public threats. It showed he was willing to use social media not just as a side tool, but as a primary weapon in his foreign policy arsenal.
Bypassing everything else if he thought it would work.
If he thought it would achieve his desired outcome through sort of sheer force of public declaration.
The implications of that style must be massive. I mean, how do other countries even respond when a threat like that comes via a social media post?
That's the core disruption, isn't it? It throws the entire playbook out the window. Established protocols just don't cover this scenario. It creates immediate confusion and potentially long-term damage to relationships. The surprise and dismay among diplomats is well documented.
Because their whole world is built on precision, on trust in channels' predictable responses.
Exactly. And this just shatters that. It makes their job infinitely harder. How do you conduct careful, quiet diplomacy when the person at the top might just broadcast a threat to the world without warning? It erodes the very foundation of their work.
And it shifts diplomacy itself, right? From this slow, deliberate process that allows for back channels for de-escalation.
To this rapid-fire, high-stakes public arena where one post can ignite a crisis with almost no room to maneuver discreetly.
What about how it plays out with audiences? Does that direct, confrontational style make a leader look strong to people at home?
That's the complex part. For some domestic audiences, yes, sources suggest it absolutely conveys strength, toughness, being in control, not bound by old rules.
But internationally, or even to other parts of the domestic audience?
It can look incredibly impulsive, reckless even, lacking thought, potentially leading to dangerous miscalculations. So the perception really depends heavily on your viewpoint, your pre-existing beliefs about that leader and about U.S. power.
Which brings us to a really critical point, something you, the listener, might be wondering. How did he get away with this? I mean, normalizing this kind of communication.
That's a key question the sources grapple with. Part of it might be the sheer novelty, the disruption factor. Traditional systems weren't really equipped to handle it initially, and partly, perhaps, the unique position of the U.S. as a superpower.
But it raises the inevitable follow-up. What if the tables were turned? What if, say, the leader of North Korea or Russia or China started doing this?
Exactly. What if they posted, "We know exactly where the so-called president is hiding"? How would the U.S. react?
It's a chilling thought experiment.
It really is. Because Trump's approach, whether intentionally or not, did sort of normalize this highly personal, direct, aggressive online communication between leaders. If that were directed at the U.S., the traditional diplomatic responses would be severely tested.
How would the State Department even respond? Do you issue a formal protest about a tweet?
That's the dilemma. The public nature bypasses all the usual quiet channels for de-escalation. It forces an immediate public response. Do you dignify the social media threat with an official reaction, thereby validating this new, weird channel?
Or do you try to ignore it and risk looking weak or like you're not taking a public threat seriously?
It's a massive diplomatic headache. This whole era of potential threat by tweet fundamentally changes the game. What counts as provocation? How do nations signal intent or respond to hostility when it's happening in real time on a public platform? It really challenges the mechanisms we have for stability.
A very high-stakes gamble, as you said. Okay, let's shift gears slightly, though it's deeply connected. This concept of gaslighting, it's become such a buzzword, especially in politics. What does it really mean in this context?
It's crucial to define it carefully because it's often used loosely. In a political context, fundamentally, gaslighting is a tactic. It's deliberate. It's designed to undermine trust, to make people doubt what's real, to manipulate public perception.
So it's more than just lying.
Oh, much more. It's about systematically creating confusion, shaping narratives constantly so that it becomes genuinely difficult for the public or certain groups to know what the truth is. The goal is to implant your preferred version of reality.
And that maintains power, right? Control the narrative, control the people.
Essentially, yes. It leverages our own cognitive biases, erodes our collective grasp on facts. It's a psychological game on a huge scale.
Our sources provide some examples. Let's start with the context of how the term has been applied to discussions around Israel and media narratives.
Right. This isn't about taking sides on the conflict itself, but about how communication about the conflict is analyzed. There are accusations, documented in our sources, of media bias or manipulation, where certain Western outlets are seen as favoring particular narrative.
How does that play out?
Well, the criticism is that this can lead to portrayals that, say, minimize Palestinian suffering, or maybe present Israeli actions without the necessary historical or political context, effectively guiding the audience towards a specific conclusion.
Like focusing only on a defensive action without mentioning the broader occupation context, perhaps.
That's the kind of example raised. It shapes a one-sided view by selectively presenting information.
And a key part of this, according to the sources, is the omission of context. That seems critical for gaslighting.
Absolutely. It's what you don't say. For instance, some analyses point out how discussions might consistently leave out major historical events, like Israel's 2005 unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Now, that was a complex event with complex consequences, but omitting it entirely
Allows you to shape a simpler, perhaps misleading narrative about why things are the way they are now.
Exactly. It misleads about root causes by denying the full picture. It's like saying, this is reality, and those other inconvenient facts, just ignore them.
And this isn't just media analysis. There are accusations of political gaslighting by governments, too, including the U.S.
Yes. The sources point to instances where the U.S. government has been accused of sending conflicting messages, particularly regarding the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Think about publicly stating a strong desire for a ceasefire, which sounds positive, humanitarian, aligns with international calls.
Okay.
But then, simultaneously, perhaps taking actions that critics argue prolong the conflict, like blocking ceasefire resolutions at the UN, or continuing certain types of military aid without conditions.
That creates a real disconnect, cognitive dissonance for anyone trying to understand the policy.
Precisely. It's saying we want peace while acting in ways that seem to hinder it. That confusion, that difficulty in reconciling words and actions, is a hallmark of gaslighting.
And this can feed into wider propaganda efforts, too.
Yeah, definitely. Sources highlight propaganda campaigns aimed at gaslighting perceptions of Israel itself. Things like equating the state with terrorists or consistently framing conflicts as solely Israel's fault, ignoring defensive aspects or actions by opposing groups.
And this has a real impact on public opinion.
The analysis suggests yes. These kinds of sustained campaigns, which leverage gaslighting and narrative manipulation, have been linked to shifts in public views, including unfavorable opinions of Israel among segments of the U.S. population. It shows how effective these tactics can be.
Okay, so that's the context. Now let's bring it back to Donald Trump. How have critics applied this concept of gaslighting specifically to his communication strategies? How did he allegedly use it?
This is where it becomes really central to understanding his political style, according to the analyses we reviewed. He's widely seen by critics as using gaslighting quite deliberately as a political weapon.
A weapon for what purpose?
Primarily to undermine trust, especially trust in established institutions like the media, and also to actively create doubt in the public mind about what's real, what's true.
Right. One thing often noted is his tendency to inflate his own popularity or create confusion around facts and figures. Is that part of it?
Absolutely. The sources describe this in detail. It's not seen as accidental confusion. It's analyzed as a calculated strategy to consolidate power over his supporters. By constantly shifting the narrative, challenging expert consensus, questioning data.
He forces his audience to rely more and more on him as the source of truth.
Exactly. You see examples like him citing poll numbers way outside the norm, or using anecdotes as proof of widespread trends directly contradicting established metrics. It makes his supporters distrust other sources and trust him implicitly.
And this often involved, well, documented falsehoods or misleading statements, didn't it? Revising history, boasting.
Extensively documented, yes. Critics point to frequent examples of him revising past events to fit his current story, even against clear evidence. Think about the inauguration crowd size debate or claims about economic achievements that didn't quite match official data. And yes, boasting, exaggerating accomplishments, and using these distortions to attack opponents by misrepresenting their records or intentions.
Is there a specific example from the sources about gaslighting a particular group?
Yes. A potent example discussed is the accusation that his administration gaslit Arab and Muslim voters.
How so?
Well, despite a record of policies often seen as detrimental to Palestinian interests, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Golan Heights sovereignty, things broadly opposed by Palestinians, The claim was made that a second Trump term would actually benefit Palestinians and the wider Arab Muslim world.
That seems like a direct contradiction.
It's presented as a classic gaslighting example, telling a group something that clashes dramatically with their reality and his own policy record, aiming to confuse or manipulate their perception, maybe even sway their vote, projecting an image of working towards peace while enacting policies seen as hindering it.
And the impact on his core supporters. How did this constant narrative shaping affect them?
The analysis suggests it was highly effective in implanting his version of reality. It made it genuinely hard for many supporters to separate objective truth from his narrative, especially on complex issues like Israel or Iran. They often accepted his framing, even when it seemed contradictory or flew in the face of expert consensus.
Creating a powerful echo chamber.
A very powerful one, where his statements became self-validating within that group, regardless of outside evidence.
You mentioned contradictions. His messaging often seemed inconsistent, didn't it? Praising a leader one day, attacking them the next. How does that fit the gaslighting model?
It's fascinating, actually. From the outside, yes, it looks wildly inconsistent, maybe even chaotic. But for supporters, that very inconsistency could be spun or interpreted favorably.
Oh.
It could be seen as him being unpredictable, a master negotiator keeping enemies off balance, or just flexible, always putting America first, even if the tactics change. It allows the audience to project their own preferred interpretation onto his actions. So apparent contradictions aren't necessarily a weakness in this model. They can actually reinforce loyalty by allowing multiple favorable readings.
That's quite a dynamic. And central to this, the sources mention a specific tactic. DARVO. Can you break that down?
Yes, DARVO is crucial here. It stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a really powerful, often disorienting, gaslighting technique used to deflect blame.
Okay, walk us through it. Deny.
First, when accused of wrongdoing, you deny it, flat out, often vehemently. I never did that.
Attack.
Then, you attack the accuser, discredit them personally, question their motives, their sanity, their credibility. They're crazy, they have an agenda, they're lying.
And reverse victim and offender.
This is the key twist. You flip the script. You portray yourself as the actual victim of a witch hunt, a conspiracy, unfair treatment. And the person who initially accused you, they are reframed as the real villain, the perpetrator.
Can you give an example of how this played out according to the sources?
There are many cited. Think about the response to investigations or criticisms, for instance, regarding Russian interference in the 2016 election. The pattern was often deny the intelligence findings, attack the intelligence agencies and investigators, deep state, corrupt, and then reverse, portraying himself as the victim of an unprecedented, illegal witch hunt orchestrated by opponents.
So blame is deflected, responsibility avoided, and the narrative completely flipped.
Exactly. We saw similar patterns described in response to criticism over the handling of tariffs, the COVID-19 pandemic. Deny the problem or downplay it, attack the critics, media experts, and frame himself as the one being unfairly targeted while trying to do the right thing. It's incredibly effective at creating confusion and shifting focus.
So bringing this back to you, the listener, recognizing these patterns, the denial, the attack, the victim reversal, how does that help navigate the political information storm? What's the takeaway?
It's about becoming a more critical consumer of information. It means developing maybe a healthy skepticism. Not cynicism, but skepticism. When you hear absolute denials, personal attacks instead of substance, claims of victimhood in response to scrutiny, pause.
Question it.
Question it. Ask, is this DARVO in action? Am I being gaslit? Actively seek out multiple reliable sources. Be aware of attempts to undermine your sense of reality or confuse your perception. It's about building your own resilience against manipulation.
Becoming a sort of truth detective in a way.
In a way, yes. In an era of pervasive narrative warfare, you almost have to be.
Okay, this leads us to the third major theme. The criticism that Trump's communication style and behavior were often perceived as childlike. This feels related to gaslighting, but distinct. What's the core idea here?
The core criticism, as laid out in many analyses, is that his actions and words often resemble those of a petulant child rather than a mature, seasoned leader. And again, this isn't just about isolated incidents, but perceived patterns.
So what are the specific manifestations of this childlike behavior that critics point to?
The sources highlight several recurring themes. One of the most obvious is the impulsive nature of his tweets and posts.
Right, the late-night tweet storms, the immediate reaction.
Exactly. That's often compared directly to a child's impulsivity acting or speaking without fully thinking through the consequences. For a president, that can trigger diplomatic crises, tank markets. It suggests a lack of consideration for the ripple effects.
Like a kid lashing out without understanding the damage?
That's the comparison often made. Then there's the name-calling and insults. We've touched on this, but it's central to the childlike critique.
Little Marco, Crooked Hillary, Rocket Man.
Yes. The tendency to resort to personal, often demeaning nicknames for opponents, leaders, even his own staff. Critics see this as petty, vindictive, more suited to a schoolyard than the Oval Office. It lacks the expected decorum and maturity.
What about responding to criticism? How does that fit?
Critics point to the pattern of denial and deflection. When faced with criticism, or facts he didn't like, the response was often outright denial, blaming others, shifting focus, much like a child refusing to take responsibility, declaring things fake news rather than engaging with the substance.
It's avoiding accountability.
That's the core of it. And connected to that are what critics termed the public tantrums.
The rallies, the press conferences sometimes.
Exactly. The outbursts, often via tweets too, characterized by exaggerated emotion, repetitive phrases, a refusal to engage rationally, and an apparent need to dominate. These are compared to a child throwing a fit to get their way or command attention.
Simplistic solutions were another point raised in the sources, right?
Yes, proposing very simple answers to incredibly complex problems. Build the wall, make America great again. While powerful slogans, critics argue they represent an oversimplification suited to a child's understanding clear, easy answers that ignore the nuance needed for effective governance.
Easy to grasp, hard to implement realistically.
Precisely. Then there's the attention-seeking aspect. Many actions and statements were interpreted by critics as being primarily driven by a need for media coverage and public acclaim.
Like a child constantly needing approval and validation.
That's the parallel drawn, a focus on being the center of attention, dominating the news cycle, regardless of whether the attention was positive or negative.
A more serious criticism linked to this perception is about empathy.
Yes, a perceived lack of empathy or emotional intelligence. Critics frequently pointed to responses to tragedies or suffering that seemed detached, insensitive, or self-focused. This was compared to a child's difficulty in understanding or responding appropriately to others' emotions.
And the inconsistency we talked about earlier also feeds into this.
It does. The sudden policy reversals, the contradictory statements. Critics argue this created chaos and uncertainty, similar to a child changing their mind impulsively, leaving everyone scrambling to adapt.
Making coherent strategy difficult for allies and staff alike.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the gaslighting tactics, particularly Darvo, are also framed within this childlike critique.
How so?
The refusal to accept blame, the deflection, the victim reversal. It sees reinforcing the image of immaturity, like a child who simply cannot admit they did anything wrong and tries to manipulate the situation to avoid consequences.
Finally, the sources mention public displays of power. How does that relate?
Critics argue that the frequent resort to overt threats, military action, tariffs, pulling out of treaties wasn't just strategy, but sometimes seemed like a child's attempt to assert dominance when challenged. A raw display of "I'm the boss" through force rather than negotiation or collaboration.
So putting it all together, the impulsivity, insults, denial, tantrums, simple solutions, attention-seeking, lack of empathy, inconsistency, gaslighting, power displays the overall picture painted by critics is one of
Immaturity. Impulsivity. More akin, they argue, to a child navigating the world than a measured, responsible leader.
So for you listening, what does it mean when these kinds of behaviors are so widely attributed to a major world leader? How does understanding this critical perspective potentially change how you interpret political messages, not just from Trump, but maybe from any leader?
It pushes us to look beyond just policy positions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To consider the behavioral patterns, the communication style, and ask whether those traits serve good governance, foster trust, and promote stability. It adds another layer to our critical analysis of leadership in this modern media age.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this. We've looked at the direct social media threats, the complex use of gaslighting, and this critical lens of childlike communication. How do these pieces fit together? How do they define this unique approach to leadership and public engagement?
They intersect quite powerfully, I think. They form a sort of cohesive, though highly unconventional system. You see this constant tension playing out.
Tension between,
For example, the desire for rapid, direct, unfiltered communication. The tweet, the post, and the slow, careful, nuanced world of traditional diplomacy. One is about instant impact, emotion, the other about calculation, relationship building. Choosing the former consistently reshapes expectations globally.
And there's the tension between truth and narrative too, right? Fueled by the gaslighting.
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
deliberate blurring of lines between objective fact and the preferred political story. When leaders consistently challenge verifiable reality, deny evidence, use RV, it creates this profound uncertainty. Can we even agree on basic facts anymore? That's a fundamental challenge to an informed public.
Which creates that paradox we talked about. The same style seen as charismatic and strong by supporters.
It is simultaneously seen as immature, impulsive, and dangerous by critics. That polarization, that intense, visceral reaction he evokes, stems directly from this unique combination of communication tactics and perceived behaviors.
So for you, the listener, why does understanding all this matter day to day?
In this age of absolute information overload, recognizing these patterns is, frankly, a survival skill. It helps you cut through the noise. Is this a genuine policy statement or a distraction? Is this an argument or an attack using Darvo? Is this strength or impulsivity with potentially dangerous consequences?
It encourages more critical thinking.
Definitely. Question assumptions. Seek context. Don't just react emotionally. Consider different viewpoints. It's about building that internal filter to analyze information more effectively, especially powerful political speech.
And what about the bigger picture, the impact on trust in institutions?
That's a huge implication. When these tactics become normalized, especially from the top, what does it do to public trust? Trust in media, trust in government, trust in expertise, trust in facts themselves. It risks eroding the common ground needed for society to function. It fuels polarization.
And looking forward, could this influence future political communication? Is this the new normal?
That's the big question, isn't it? Are we seeing a permanent shift where leaders feel they need to be this direct, this confrontational online to connect or project strength? Will citizens come to expect this unfiltered communication? Trump's presidency might be a blueprint, or at least a major case study, for how power and influence operate in the digital age. Future leaders, and all of us as citizens, will be navigating its legacy.
So this deep dive, it really goes beyond just one person.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the changing tools of power, influence, and communication, and the challenges we all face in maintaining an informed, critical citizenry in this environment.
We've covered a lot of ground. We looked closely at Donald Trump's use of direct social media threats, highlighting that really stark quote, "We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding."
Then we unpacked political gaslighting, how it's been analyzed in the context of Israel narratives, and how critics argued Trump used it himself, including that Darvo tactic, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender.
And finally, we examined that critical perspective, framing his communication style as childlike, connecting specific behaviors like impulsivity, name-calling, and deflection to this critique.
It paints a picture of a very distinct, very disruptive communication strategy.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. In this digital world where personal expression and official diplomacy seem to merge on our screens daily, what does it really mean for a leader to communicate directly?
And perhaps more importantly, what responsibility does that put on us, the audience, the citizens? The responsibility to critically evaluate every statement, every tweet, every claim, especially from those holding immense power.
It really makes you wonder, how is this era of direct, unfiltered communication from the highest offices reshaping the very essence of power, influence, and maybe even accountability on the world stage?
That's a question we'll likely be grappling with for a long time to come. Thanks for tuning in to the Despicable Maine Deep Dive podcast. Remember, the United States has been hijacked, so soon living in the United States will be theft of your life. And as always, living in Maine is theft of your life. Every day you are there is just another day stolen.